Hey there, my name's Curtis Lucas, and you're watching Empire Building. So there's something I've been thinking about a lot lately as more and more people that I've been talking to are becoming more and more interested in this opportunity when it comes to Bitcoin mining stocks. And very often, one of the first questions I get is, when do I sell? And the more and more I think about this, the more and more I realize that it really is a very personal decision. I've been wrestling with this concept myself, and the more and more I think about it, the more and more torn I become. I mean, we've all heard the phrase, it's time in the market, not timing the market. But as far back as we've been able to see in this market, it's just bubble after bubble after bubble. Or is it? Bitcoin has never really taken more than 3 years to recover to its former all-time high. Any bubble throughout history has never recovered that quickly, which begs the question, is it a bubble? Or is it just a continuation of the uptrend? Having said that, these longer-term corrections do tend to last a significant amount of time. And anyone who has lived through them has always had this regret of, why didn't I sell at the top and buy at the bottom? Even though they full well know that having held on has proven to be a winning strategy, outperforming every other market. So the question here becomes, what are your objectives? What is it you hope to gain out of this transaction? What do you hope to gain by holding on to these stocks? And the answer to that is going to be different for every single person. But as always, what I want to focus in on here is offering some perspective. If you spend any time on YouTube at all, you're going to hear all kinds of theories about when the market is going to top up. Some will look at it by the date. They know exactly the date that we're going to top up, or they know exactly the price that we're going to top off. And all of these things are simply based on previous market behavior, trying to extrapolate that to future results, trying to predict exactly how Bitcoin is going to behave. If you want my 2 cents, I think they're probably all wrong. Trying to predict Bitcoin's future behavior by looking at its past is like trying to predict the behavior of a teenager by looking at their childhood. As you grow and mature, you're not the same person you once were. And the way you respond to situations when you're 18 are not going to be the same as it was when you were 8. And I believe Bitcoin is no different. It's a maturing asset class. But the real question here is, how mature? Much earlier on in 2020, when I first started this channel, I did a video called How to Invest in Disruption. And in this video, I took a close look at bubbles of the past, in particular, the tulip bubble. For those of you who aren't aware, the tulip bubble, or tulip mania as it's often referred to as, was the first financial speculation bubble that had ever occurred in history. People were buying and selling tulip bulbs, like the actual plant, and speculating on this, buying and selling it, to the point where one bulb was trading for the equivalent value of a countryside villa. And then, of course, as anyone now could obviously see, that bubble popped and never recovered. To this day, that is a bubble. But what people don't realize is that the tulip, in fact, was a market disruptor. If this kind of thing interests you, I highly recommend going and checking out that video. It was done when this channel was much smaller. Very few people have seen it, but it is something I was quite proud of at the time. But the point I'm getting at here is that if your objective is to time exactly the top of this next cycle, if indeed that's what this will be, the stress that that is going to induce on you is probably not going to be worth it. And in the end, you'll probably end up missing it by a long shot. But does that mean you're just supposed to sit tight and hold no matter what? That's one way you could go, but it's not necessarily right for everyone. This is why what I believe is you need to have an objective in mind. What are your plans for this money, for this wealth that you're going to be creating? This will be different for everybody. Do you just want a new car, or maybe a new house, a boat? Did you want to start your own business? Or do you just like looking at numbers going up on the screen?
You mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
I've been thinking about this a lot myself. And for anyone who's been in the cryptocurrency space for long enough, we've all got sucked into this belief that Bitcoin is going to follow these 4-year cycles as it's done ever since it was created. Last night, I had the pleasure of tuning in to the Unchained podcast by Laura Shin, where she interviewed Michael Saylor, who has been making the rounds through YouTube, sharing his viewpoint on what Bitcoin is and what it can be. And like many others, she pressed him on what it would take for him to choose to sell his Bitcoin. And for Michael, he's always been consistent with this. His opinion is simply sell it and then buy what? More fiat? Go back to fiat? That was the problem he had in the first place. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
So MicroStrategy's average purchase price was a little less than 16,000. And right now, the price is about 33,000. So you've more than doubled your investment. And most likely by the end of the year, we're probably going to be in some kind of bubble, I imagine. So the return will be even higher. And you've said that you didn't buy the Bitcoin to sell it. But would MicroStrategy ever take some off the table when you sense the market is at a top and then just buy in later when there's another correction? Or do you just plan to hodl through all the cycles, and weather those, whatever 80% downturns when the crypto markets are in a bear market?
Yeah, again, I just disagree with your characterization. I don't expect an 80% downturn. I don't think it's a speculative asset, and I don't think you can quote unquote take money off the table. You're speaking like a crypto trader right now, right? Yeah, I mean, maybe you're doing it just to represent their interest, but I don't see the world that way. I think that Bitcoin is sound money. It's the technically superior asset class compared to the dollar, the euro, the peso, the bolivar, compared to a stock index, compared to gold, compared to silver, compared to everything you can conceivably buy. It is technically, thermodynamically superior as an asset. So when you say things like that to me, and maybe you just do it just to see what I'll say back, I just imagine you preaching to me in Argentina while you're asking me if I'm going to sell the dollars and buy pesos back again as the peso sleeps from 20 to the dollar to 40 to the dollar to 80 to the dollar. Or if we're in, Venezuela. I mean, you think a Venezuelan company is going to quote unquote take some money off the table by selling their U.S. stocks and their U.S. dollars to buy back into local currencies? Or then, in Zimbabwe, you think they would take money off the table, right? The point is, if you have the superior asset, it's going up forever, Laura. Forever.
Right. I mean, right. But I mean, we can all look Bitcoin sort of as numerous investors have talked about it, kind of breathes, after having the next year and a half after it tends to go up. And then after it reaches some kind of bubble, it kind of sighs a little bit. And then, then after the next halving, we see it go up. But, so it's this kind of up and down cycle, but the overall trajectory is up. So, and it's not, these are on Twitter, people were asking me to ask you this as well. I think it's a perfectly, natural question to ask.
I think, I don't think Bitcoin is volatile if you're an investor. If you're a hodler, if your time horizon is 1 year, or if it's 1 year, you're a short-term investor. You can find 2 or 3 times in the last decade when it wasn't great, but it wasn't awful. If your time horizon is 4 years, you can't find a time when it wasn't working. So I think, just a normal, ordinary, responsible investor with a 4-year time horizon will look at it and say, this is very boring. But this is an engineering issue for me. This is the year's 1910. People are wiring their houses with electricity. And you're asking me at what point I'm going to turn my electricity off, or you're telling me how eventually people are going to get tired of electricity. And then you're telling me that wouldn't I really want to convert back to horse and buggy and manual labor to take some off the table because electricity is a scary speculative thing. And I'm like, no, it's running water, it's electricity, it's automobiles. It's not a fad, it's the future. It's not a bubble. It's capital flow. When all the money is leaving the peso going to the dollar, that's not a bubble in the dollar. That's capital flight from a collapsing asset or a collapsing currency that people have lost confidence in. Just like the stampede to the internet. Like, would you ask a company, when are you going to stop using the internet? Are you going to stop using it in a quarter because you've used too much electricity and internet? So at the end of the day, none of this statistics matters. None of the trading matters. None of the volatility matters. These, people that are living in their little world, studying their Fibonacci retracements and preaching with like incredible conviction about the upcoming expected 60% retracement or 80% retracement, they're overlooking this fundamental issue, which is if Bitcoin is a digital monetary network, and if enough people with money and power decide to adopt it, it's going to go up and increase by a factor of 100 or 1,000, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And its past is completely irrelevant to its future.
Now, this entire interview went on for a little over an hour and a half. Anyone who has the time, I certainly suggest you check this one out. But my takeaway from this is he's sharing with us the mindset of billionaires who he believes will inevitably begin to enter this space, most likely in the near future. And I have to agree with him that once this begins to happen, the behavior of Bitcoin is going to begin to change and evolve. And the exact metrics of Bitcoin's past behavior is probably not going to be indicative of the future. And this is what I think is going to happen. And it has to do with a recent video that I published titled, "The Greatest Wealth Transfer in History is Happening Right Now." But really, I think it'll be happening later this year when all of these hodlers or early adopters of Bitcoin will begin to unload it on the market, thinking that they're timing the top because this is exactly the time that Bitcoin topped out in every previous cycle. And they're simply just going to swoop in and buy it at the bottom after waiting maybe 6 months to a year, as if Bitcoin is going to behave exactly the way it had done in the past. See, I'm a contrarian at heart, so I tend to believe that if everyone is thinking one thing, the opposite is what will actually happen. Just the fact that so many people have caught on and have been mentally programmed to believe that Bitcoin is going to behave exactly this way is all the reason you need to believe that it won't. So what this leaves us with is the distinct probability that near the end of this year, there will be a significant downturn where many people will be ready and willing to unload their Bitcoin. But I think they will be shocked and surprised to find out who it is that will end up buying it. Maybe not at the very top, but certainly when they're least expecting it. Selling Bitcoin between $100,000 and say $300,000 could prove to be the cheapest you'll end up being able to get it for the rest of time. But what does this mean for the mining stocks? Things are going to get even more unpredictable. One thing I have observed is that the mining stocks are always trying to anticipate what Bitcoin is going to do next. So just like in 2017, and here I am looking back into the past, the mining stocks all topped out significantly before Bitcoin did. So what I'm getting at here is trying to time this is going to be impossible. I don't care what anybody tells you, no date or price target is going to prepare you for exactly what is going to happen. And your decision to sell is going to be a very personal one, even if that decision is not to sell at all. Maybe you're going to choose to hold a 10-year horizon and be damned what the price does during that time. Will mining still be around 10 years from now? Yeah, otherwise Bitcoin wouldn't be. And yes, it will still be profitable. And I happen to believe that these mining companies, especially through these incredible bull markets, will be able to amass such an incredible amount of wealth that they'll be able to utilize that to expand into other blockchain and cryptocurrency related products. I don't believe mining companies will always be solely mining companies. Think about Amazon. It didn't stay a bookstore. Google is not just a search engine. And if you look at Netflix, when it started, it was just an automated DVD vending machine inside grocery stores. So if you clicked on this video thinking that I was going to tell you exactly when you were supposed to sell, I'm sorry to disappoint. But let me make it clear that I am not telling you that you should never sell. You just need to be aware of what your personal objectives are. Like Michael Saylor said, the only thing that would cause him to sell is if he had something better to do with that money. But remember, you're not Michael Saylor. You don't have Michael Saylor problems. I said before, the reason why I started this channel was that I wanted to document my own journey into building my own empire. And investing in these cryptocurrency or Bitcoin mining stocks was the fastest way and the greatest opportunity that I could see, that I understood well enough that I was willing to put it all on the line. But this technology is not going anywhere, no matter how obscene or overvalued any of these companies might become. But I do have a plan. For me personally, my hope is to be able to utilize at least some of the capital that I raise by investing in these stocks and funnel that into a real estate empire, as it were. Now, when I do that is not necessarily clear, but I do know no matter what happens, I'm never going to be fully abandoning this space and moving to real estate, because I recognize that no matter when this time comes and when I want to divest into this other market, blockchain and cryptocurrency isn't going anywhere. No different than the fact that tulips weren't going anywhere after that bubble. And as I pointed out in my video on that topic, following the tulip bubble, that area of the world to this day remains the leader in horticulture products. Not just tulips, but all of it. Bubbles fuel innovation. They are a necessary component of disruption. But part of the question here is, are we in fact in a bubble? As Michael Saylor put it, was electricity a bubble? Was the internet a bubble? It did lead to the dot-com bubble, but even if you look at the NASDAQ today, we are well above the so-called bubble that we were in the year 2000. Yes, those prices did decline substantially, roughly 80%, and it took 16 years for the NASDAQ to reach the level that it formed in the year 2000. And as of now, even if you had invested in, say, the NASDAQ at that time, you'd still be doing fairly well off by now. And if you had been cost averaging through that entire period, you'd have nothing to worry about. But again, this is why your objectives is what matters. My objective is to build an empire that produces steady and consistent cash flow, and always keep my finger on the pulse of this disruptive, new, groundbreaking technology that is going to change how we live and work. And I'm also paying a close ear to people like Michael Saylor, because he is doing his best to try to enlighten us, inform us how the rich think. I'm going to share another clip with you of Michael Saylor when he's discussing this idea with the Funky Crypto podcast. In this, he shares an important mindset of the rich and what their mindset is when it comes to assets and the strategies that they employ to make sure they are able to participate in future growth, but still capitalize on the growing value of their assets without suffering the tax implications. Because while it might sound great to sell Bitcoin or other crypto assets for massive gains, as soon as you do that, you have to face the tax man. Here's how the rich deal with that.
Ben, let me just say one more thing.
Okay.
The people that I know, the wealthiest families in the world, they're like these New York City families where you ask them, where's your money come from? And they're like, oh, my great-grandfather, he bought like 4 city blocks in Manhattan. And they're like, did you ever sell that? It's like, no, we still own it. They own it for 100 years.
Yes.
If you have really good property, like if you owned a block on Central Park in Manhattan, do you think there's any year in the last 100 years it would have been a good idea to sell it, pay capital gains tax, and buy something else?
Only 2020.
What they do, only this year maybe. So what they do is they hold it for 100 years.
Yeah.
And as people print more dollars, the value of the property goes up at the rate that the Federal Reserve prints dollars. And then every 5 years, they refinance it and they borrow more money against it.
Yeah.
So if you borrow against an asset that's appreciating in value, you don't pay capital gains tax. And then the money you borrow, you can live off of, and you don't pay income tax on it. So if you have the world's perfect, if you own a city block in cyberspace that's good for the next 100 years, that's Bitcoin, right? A Bitcoin is a city block in cyberspace. If you own that, and if I told you 1 billion people are coming to that city and they're all going to need to buy their own block, and you own the right property, it's the Manhattan of cyberspace. Why don't you just keep it in the family for 100 years? And the next time you feel you need some money, well, you go borrow money against your Bitcoin. There's no capital gains tax. There's no income tax. If Bitcoin was going up 100% a year, you're getting paid 100% tax-free interest, and you're going to pay 5% interest to borrow the money. It's a 95% difference, right? So you don't want to sell because you get tagged for the taxes, and then you stop generating the yield on the property. Really wealthy families, they just keep the assets forever and they just finance them. That's what they do.
So what he's getting at is, if you want to access some of the capital stored within your Bitcoin and pull it out in fiat, you can do that by simply borrowing against that asset, the same way you would do with a piece of real estate. In his mind, Bitcoin is digital real estate, and I happen to agree with him. The interest on borrowing against that asset would be significantly less than the capital gains tax you would be forced to pay if you had sold that asset. And if that asset continues to appreciate, you still get to benefit from it. And it just so happens, if that asset would happen to depreciate in value, assuming you didn't go and spend all the money you borrowed against it, you could simply put some of that money back into it and increase your position, never having had to pay the capital gains tax you would have had to pay had you sold it. Now, this is Bitcoin we're talking about, not cryptocurrency or Bitcoin mining stocks. Although I have started to do a little bit of research on this topic, and it would seem it is possible, but I'm not ready to elaborate that on any further until I've fully dived in and maybe even attempted to do this myself. But the point is, you can see there are numerous strategies available. And I don't think we're anywhere near the point where we really have to start worrying about this yet. But what you should start thinking about is, what are your objectives? What is it you want to build for yourself? And continue to educate yourself on how this market continues to develop. If you feel you've reached the point where your objectives have been completely fulfilled and you're more than happy to sell, take that money off the table and go and do something else with it, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Even if you didn't time the top perfectly, I believe that as long as your mindset has you focused on building sustained, consistent cash flow and learning how to get money to work for you, you can't go wrong. And if you really don't have any immediate or even near-term future plans for any of this money, and you're more than happy to just leave it there and let it ride for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you'll probably do just fine as well. And who knows, maybe you'll do better than anyone. But just because that's right for you doesn't necessarily mean it's the right choice for someone else who may be trying to start something, build something for themselves. I'm excited to see what's going to come out of all of this. Not just in terms of how high the stock prices can go, but what difference it makes in the lives of the people who are watching my channel. Some of you may only be starting with a few $100s. For some, it may be a few $1 million. The important part is, try not to get too caught up on the day-to-day price movements. If you want to trade it, go ahead. Nobody's stopping you. It's your money. But just imagine what kind of a head spin you're going to end up in when and if these stocks ever start behaving the way GameStop is or has been for the last few days. The only thing that's going to protect you in that scenario is if you've got a plan and you stick to it. If you get carried away trying to time a market that moves like that, it'll be like trying to steer a ship without a rudder in a windstorm. You're just going to get blown against the rocks and you will get wrecked. Just think about what you want out of this. In the long run, you'll be better off for it. And if you got what you feel you need out of it and you feel like you've had enough and you don't want to be a part of it any longer, there's nothing to feel bad about. But I would recommend maybe pick up some Bitcoin while you're at it. One of my own personal goals is to personally acquire at least 21 Bitcoin. Today's cost on that would be somewhere around 640,000 US dollars. And as part of my real estate empire, that would be my own little digital corner of Bitcoin real estate. One that I could pass on through the generations. On top of that, I'd also like to have at least 10 Ethereum validators or 320 ETH. I've got one, still got to work on the other 9. And then on top of that, I look forward to building on this technology myself, building businesses centered around this. In addition to real estate, the real opportunities are ones we haven't even heard of yet, ones that haven't even been dreamed up yet. So I can't even tell you what they'll be, but I'll have my finger on this pulse. So when they come, I'll be paying attention. And this is why all I'm getting at here is that timing this thing is not going to help you. What matters is that you have a plan. Stick to it and pay attention. Don't get caught up in trying to get off at the top and somehow think you're going to get back on at some other time. Just build your empire. This will be here the whole time, but build something. And when you've got that steady cash flow, you can always funnel it back in. Was there ever a time in the last 10 years that was a bad idea to invest in technology? If you can point that out, I'd love to hear about it, because as far as I can see, no matter when you would have chosen to invest, you'd be in profit right now. So just for fun, down in the comments, I'd like to invite you all to discuss what it is your plans are. Maybe you don't know. Maybe you'll get some ideas. But really, this is the kind of community and this is the kind of ideas I want to try and foster. Keep your mind on the empire and you'll be able to steer that ship exactly where you want it to go. That's all for this one. Now let's get back to empire building. Bye.